There is a can of sardines sitting on a grocery shelf right now, priced under $2, that holds more usable plant nutrition than a $40 bag of synthetic fertilizer. Nitrogen for leaves, phosphorus for roots and fruit, calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and a spectrum of ocean trace minerals that no three-number bag will ever list. Buried correctly, that single can feeds a planting site for an entire season and leaves the soil richer than it found it. The fertilizer industry built a $230 billion business, making sure you reached for the bag instead of the can. The story usually starts at Plymouth, in the autumn of 1621. A native man named Squanto, the legend says, taught the starving English settlers to drop a fish into each hill of corn, and the harvest that followed saved the colony. It is one of the most repeated agricultural stories in American history. It is also, according to the scholarship, mostly myth. In 1975, anthropologist Lynn Sessi published a paper in the journal Science examining the documentary record. Her conclusion was uncomfortable. There is little evidence that burying fish was a traditional, widespread native practice at all. Squanto had spent years in Europe before returning home, and the technique he demonstrated was most likely one he picked up from European farmers and carried back across the Atlantic. The famous Indian secret was, in all probability, a borrowed one. But here is what the myth got right, even while it got the history wrong. The fish worked, the corn grew, and the reason it grew has nothing to do with folklore and everything to do with what happens in the soil when flesh, bone, and oil begin to break down. So why did a technique this cheap and this effective fade into a campfire story? The answer arrives in 1909 in a German laboratory. A chemist named Fritz Haber learned to pull nitrogen out of thin air and forge it into ammonia. Synthetic fertilizer was born, and within a single generation it rewrote how the world fed itself. Yields climbed. So did dependency. The new model was simple and profitable. Sell a bag of 3 nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, that dissolves fast, feeds fast, and disappears fast, so the gardener comes back next spring and buys another. 17 elements matter to a living plant. The bag sells you 3. The rotting fish in that buried hill delivered far more, slowly, on the plant's schedule instead of the manufacturer's. That was precisely the problem. You cannot patent a sardine. This is not fringe theory. University extension programs, the most cautious and conservative voices in gardening, have studied fish as fertilizer for decades. The University of Illinois Extension reports that a typical fish product carries an NPK of roughly 2, 4, 1, along with calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and other micronutrients, and that its proteins feed the soil microorganisms that build long-term fertility. The University of Minnesota and the University of Maryland both list fish-based amendments as legitimate organic options. What no laboratory has run is a large controlled trial on the exact act of burying one sealed can. So everything that follows is built on 2 things that are not in dispute: what fish is made of, and what soil biology does to it once it is in the ground. Here is what actually happens when you bury that can. Number 1. The nitrogen release. The flesh of a sardine is roughly 2/3 protein by dry weight, and protein is, chemically, a storehouse of nitrogen. Nitrogen is the single nutrient plants burn through fastest. It builds leaves, stems, and the green machinery of photosynthesis, and a deficiency shows up as the pale yellow older leaves every gardener has cursed at. A synthetic nitrogen bag dumps it all at once in a soluble form, and what the roots cannot grab in the first heavy rain washes straight through the soil and into the groundwater. The nitrogen in a buried sardine behaves nothing like that. As soil bacteria dismantle the fish tissue, they convert its proteins into ammonium and then nitrate, the forms a root can actually drink, and they release it gradually over weeks as the body decomposes. There is no flush, no crash, no leaching event. The plant pulls what it needs as it needs it. One can placed beneath a tomato or a squash hill delivers a slow, steady nitrogen feed across the exact window when the plant is building its frame. Number 2. The phosphorus and calcium in the bones. Open a can of sardines and you can crush the spine between 2 fingers. Those soft, edible bones are the reason this technique outperforms a nitrogen-only feed. Bone is built from calcium phosphate, which means a single can carries both phosphorus and calcium directly into the root zone. Phosphorus is the nutrient behind root development, flowering, and fruit set, and it is notorious for a frustrating habit. In bag form, it locks itself to soil particles within weeks and becomes chemically unavailable before roots ever reach it. Bone phosphorus releases on a different clock. Soil organisms break the mineral down slowly, handing it to roots over months rather than dumping it in days. The calcium that comes with it strengthens cell walls and, in tomatoes and peppers, helps prevent the sunken brown blemish of blossom end rot, a disorder driven by calcium failing to reach the fruit. The extension data backs this. Fish products consistently test high in phosphorus relative to nitrogen, which is exactly why that 2:4:1 ratio leans the way it does. Number 3. Oil. Most people pour the oil out of the can. In the garden, that oil is half the value. Sardine oil is dense with fat, and fat is concentrated carbon and energy. When you bury the contents, oil and all, you are not just feeding the plant, you are feeding the soil's workforce. The fungi and bacteria that drive decomposition need a carbon source to fuel their own population growth, and the oil is a long-burning one. It also carries fat-soluble compounds and fatty acids that water-based fertilizers simply do not contain. There is a practical bonus too. The oil coats the surrounding soil and slows the escape of odor, which matters more than it sounds, and we will come back to why. The instruction here is the simplest in this entire video. Do not drain the can. Tip the whole thing into the hole, oil included, and let the soil's biology turn that energy into the slow combustion that powers everything else happening underground. Number 4. The ocean trace minerals. A sardine spends its life filtering one of the most mineral-rich environments on the planet, the open ocean, and it stores a fraction of that wealth in its tissue and bone. This is where a buried fish quietly outclasses the bag. Synthetic fertilizer is defined by what it leaves out. A plant needs 17 essential elements and a long tail of trace minerals, and when even one is missing, the whole system stalls, no matter how much nitrogen you pile on. Iron for the green of chlorophyll. Magnesium at the center of every chlorophyll molecule. Zinc, manganese, and the micronutrients that switch on the enzymes of growth. Fish-based amendments are documented sources of calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and a range of these trace elements. You will not find them printed on a synthetic label because the manufacturer never put them in the bag. The sardine did not need a label. It accumulated this mineral inventory the slow way. By living and burying it returns that ocean library to the soil where roots can finally reach it. Number 5. The microbial bloom. Here is the part the bag can never replicate, because it is not a nutrient at all. It is life. A buried can of sardines is a feast, and within days the soil around it erupts with microbial activity. Bacteria swarm the protein. Fungi thread through the oil and tissue. Protozoa and nematodes arrive to feed on the bacteria, and every link in that chain releases plant-available nutrients as a byproduct of its own digestion. This is the soil food web, and it is the actual engine of natural fertility. The extension research is explicit that the real long-term benefit of fish is not just the nitrogen number. It is the protein that feeds the microorganisms that build a durable, living soil. Synthetic fertilizer does the opposite. A steady diet of soluble salts suppresses this biology and leaves soil increasingly dead and dependent, which is why each season the dose has to climb. The sardine drives the trajectory the other direction. It feeds the living system that, once established, keeps feeding your plants long after the fish itself is gone. Number 6. The coffee grounds question. You will see this technique paired with a recommendation to cap the buried fish with spent coffee grounds, and this is where careful gardeners need to slow down. The honest science is more complicated than the videos suggest. Fresh, undecomposed coffee grounds are mildly toxic to plants. Research from the University of Melbourne, published in 2016, found that adding raw, spent grounds directly to soil actually reduced the growth of every crop tested, because the grounds temporarily lock up nitrogen as they break down. Washington State University Extension goes further and notes there is no scientific evidence that coffee grounds repel pests at all. So use them with discipline. Composted coffee grounds, applied as a thin on-top layer rather than a thick, concentrated mat, do improve soil structure over time and add a small amount of organic matter. But they are not the thing protecting your buried fish, and they are not a fertilizer in their own right. The real defense against odor and digging animals is not coffee. It is depth. And that is the next point. Number 7. The depth that makes it work. Everything above only works if the can goes deep enough, and depth is the single most common mistake. A buried fish is an irresistible signal to raccoons, skunks, foxes, and the neighbor's dog, and a shallow burial invites them to dig up your planting and undo the whole effort. This is not hypothetical. Gardeners attempting the technique have reported exactly this for decades, and even the historical accounts of fish in cornfields mention animals raiding the rows. The fix is straightforward. Dig down at least 12 inches, ideally closer to 18. Place the contents of the can at the bottom of the hole and cover it with a solid layer of soil before you plant above it. At that depth, the odor stays trapped, the diggers lose the scent, and the fish sits directly in the root zone, where the slow release of nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, and trace minerals lines up with the season your plant spends building roots and setting fruit. One can, buried deep, releases on the plant's schedule for months. That is the amazing thing that happens. Not magic. Decomposition, placed where it counts. The story we started with was a myth. Squanto probably learned to bury fish from Europeans, not from generations of native tradition, and the legend has been quietly corrected by historians for 50 years. But strip away the folklore, and the underlying truth is solid, and it survived every decade the fertilizer industry spent trying to make you forget it. Coastal farmers buried fish scraps long before anyone wrote a nutrient ratio on a bag. University extension offices at Illinois, Minnesota, Maryland, and beyond have spent years confirming, in plain, peer-reviewed language, that fish feeds plants and feeds the soil that feeds the plants. The knowledge was never hidden in a vault. It was simply made to look quaint, primitive, and beneath a modern gardener, right up until that modern gardener noticed the bag emptying faster every year, while the soil underneath it got worse. A can of sardines is not a relic. It is a complete, slow-release, biologically active fertilizer that costs less than a cup of coffee. Here is how to put it to work this weekend. Choose a planting site for a heavy feeder, a tomato, a squash, a pepper, or a young fruit tree. Dig a hole at least 12 inches deep. 18 is better. Open 1 can of sardines and empty the entire contents into the bottom, oil included. Cover it with at least 8 inches of soil, firm it down, and plant your start or your seed above it, never directly touching the fish. 1 standard can treats a single planting site. For a larger bed, space several cans about 3 feet apart at the same depth. Do this once at planting time, and you will not need to feed that site again for the season. The total cost is the price of 1 can of fish, roughly $1 to $2 per planting hole. Against the $30 or $40 a season, many gardeners hand the fertilizer aisle. The fish leaves the soil richer at the end. The bag leaves it poorer. That is the entire difference. The myth was wrong about the history. It was right about the harvest. And the next forgotten technique the fertilizer industry would rather you never tried is coming soon. If this one earned a place in your garden, subscribe to Hank's Gardening Journey and ring the bell. Every like and every share helps another gardener dig past the marketing and back into the soil.